here. As I always like to do, I'd like to talk about your last week's column and what's going on right now. Now, interestingly enough, last week a lot has happened, and one of the things that was being talked about here in the state was the potential last week for a lifespan takeover of Care New England. But as we have learned, and as Go Local was first to report, Care New England is now entering into talks with partners up in Massachusetts.
It's a good chance it's going to happen. It's not a sure bet because there are all sorts of regulatory and other issues involved. But it's going to be very interesting because if it actually happens, you're going to see. Well, it could raise prices. I think you're going to see more patients going to Boston, to the partners' hospitals in Boston, which include very famous places such as Massachusetts General Hospital, Brigham, the mental hospital, McLean's. And I think it's going to have very interesting effects on sort of the customer flow, as they say. I think another interesting thing, there are any number of interesting things that could come from this, is what happens to the Brown Medical School.
Yes,
Since Partners is in a very tight sleeping bag with a Harvard Medical School, and so what happens to Brown in Brown's teaching hospital connections in Rhode Island? And I don't think anyone knows, but I would think it would be a threat to Brown.
Now, they talk about this as a merger. I mean, again...
No, it's an acquisition. I remember when the Providence Journal was bought by the Texas company, Belo, and they call it a merger. And I remember writing an editorial about that, or announcing the merger, commenting on the merger and being compelled to call it a merger, but in fact it was a takeover. And, who was getting fired, whom, as the Russians like to say.
Whom. We've used that term before on Go Local before.
And I think in this case, you're going to find the senior executives of Care New England get giant golden parachutes. They'll be fine. But it's going to have, it's going to cut employment around here a bit by giving the huge pricing power, extending the huge pricing power of partners into Rhode Island may raise prices. It will, as I said, perhaps undermine the Brown Medical School, and it may end up turning all the hospitals in Rhode Island in the fullness of time into just community hospitals. Not doing research, not teaching hospitals.
What does that have to say about the state of Rhode Island? That we're not the acquirer, we're often the acquiree.
Yeah, usually, if you look around us, here we are in downtown Providence. There's this huge empty building, which used to be the site of the 6th or 7th biggest bank in the United States, which was a very big bank over there called Hospital Trust, which had, I think, the largest supply of gold in the United States outside of Fort Knox. All these big companies, there's still a few here, but I think what this shows, and it's not entirely bad, is that that Providence is really now part of Boston. And wait till they get the Hyperloop going.
You did write about the Hyperloop.
7 to 10 minutes.
We talked about it last week. You wrote about it in your column.
It's this train, magnetic, levitation. You go from here, right over the train station to South Station in about 10 minutes. And at that point, Boston and Providence will basically be the same city. This could be worse because Boston and Greater Boston is a very prosperous, dynamic, energetic place. So it's much better that, being an adjunct to Boston. I mean, we could be an adjunct to, Duluth, as much as I like Duluth and where I've actually have spent time.
No knock at Duluth, but it is interesting, again, as we had just heard last week, that Lifespan was in the mix, but now we know that it's partners, so all eyes are going to be on that. And if folks didn't read today, Go Local did write the piece, 7 potential implications.
Did. Now, I should say something about Lifespan. Now, Lifespan is under pressure, too, not like Care New England, but it's under pressure. It's entirely possible that a Boston group will come in and buy Lifespan, maybe Beth Israel, Deaconess, and Leahy. Leahy's getting absorbed into that, too, and that could happen. It could even happen that Partners buys Lifespan, too, but I think the antitrust division of the U.S. Justice Department might look askance at that. But I don't think you're going to see Lifespan as an independent operation within
Well, I have a feeling we'll be talking about this in maybe the coming months here in the Go Local studio. Right. Yeah. So let's move from healthcare to, let's talk about state government. You did point out a recent poll that showed that Rhode Islanders are both keen on the governor's proposal for free education and keen on having the reduction or the elimination of the car tax. And I think you raised the point, everybody loves free stuff.
Sure, it's an old line by, I think it was Russell Long, the senator, as Josh Fenton corrected me. I'd remember him as being a congressman. Don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the man behind the tree. And I think it's sort of a classic case of that. And people don't do the full accounting. Say, okay, we get rid of the car tax. Car tax is a local tax, a local property tax. Okay, you get rid of the car tax, and these cities and towns don't have that revenue, so somebody's going to have to make up for the revenue. Who might that be? People paying sales and income taxes. So the whole thing is sort of bad finance. The car tax is not a catastrophe. It's very sexy. The House Speaker, Mr. Mattiello, made a big promise that he was going to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. I think it's a total bad priority.
Okay.
Yeah, distortion of what we really need around here.
Speaking of priorities, one of the things you mentioned in your last column happened to be people at the State House looking to license pet groomers.
Right.
Talking about priorities.
Yeah, this is another example of kind of the growing administrative state, micromanaging everything. Say somebody cut up, did a bad job of grooming their poodle, and this has turned into some world historical catastrophe like the Zimmerman telegraph or the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, when in fact this is not the kind of thing that government should be dealing with. In fact, I don't think you should have to get a license to cut someone's human's hair.
We know there's
when I was a little kid, my father cut my hair. He had no license to do it. Perhaps he should have been incarcerated.
I think your hair looks just fine and
it's
lovely.
It's a wig, Bob. Actually. It's new, Brent. I'm glad you like it.
Well, it's interesting. They do want to. So there's a
but it's just too much.
Proposal
too
to
much
license pet groomers, but there's also legislation that hair braiders don't have to fall under the auspices of hairdressers. Yes, it is. Representative Anastasia Williams put forth this legislative proposal, gets heard from constituents, and said, again, too much regulation. So she
said that.
She said that.
I mean, maybe something's getting through.
Too much regulation. These folks.
People have been reading The Death of Common Sense by Philip K. Howard, who should go on this show. He'll talk about the administrative overreach. And by trying to regulate everything, we end up regulating nothing well.
So whether it's pet groomers or we're talking about hair braiding, kind of
get out of that. Deal
debate.
with crime, direct threats to human health.
So we hit on some of the things you talked about last week. What are you thinking about writing for this week?
Well, I'm going to talk about Freedom House, which is a think tank which monitors democracy and freedom around the world. It's bemoaning the shrinkage of freedom and the rise of autocracy in the world, at least for now, the triumph of dictatorships. And it's very depressing. And the extent to which the public has forgotten the lessons of the blood-soaked 20th century. And you may see this with the possible election of Marine Le Pen in France. I suspect your friend Jean Lesueur spoke about that. But all over the world, democracy and freedom are in retreat. And because I think people have forgotten how difficult they are to regain once you've lost them.
And this is a study that looks internationally
looks internationally
where
around the world. We've got a bit of that in this country. That's sort of a desire for autocratic, simplistic solutions. Democracy is messy, but as Winston Churchill said, it's the worst system except for all others. And
the least of all evils.
Yeah, and freedom makes a lot of people anxious, and to have a kind of a civic-minded freedom, that line from America the Beautiful, thy liberty in law, is very difficult to maintain, and once you lose it, could be gone forever.
Any other thoughts about hot topic issues that you're going to hit upon?
Let's see. Well, of course, we mentioned the health thing. Yeah, the herring, the river herring. They're under stress, and these little tiny fish. They're like sardines. They're under stress, and this is very bad because they're the stockfish, the feeder fish for a lot of other fish. And there's a suspicion maybe a lot of them are being caught, perhaps offshore, even though they come into the rivers to spawn, by people selling these things to the omega-3 manufacturers. That's the big thing.
So now we've got some laws of unintended consequences potentially, and
that's right. Yeah,
could turn
wiping out the herring. And
not a good thing.
That's very bad. So
you
watch the herring.
Watch the herring, and you touched upon it in a recent column, Bob. The fish stocks in New England.
Yeah.
And in terms of the government's involvement with that.
Yeah.
What
this is very interesting. Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to the fisher fishermen I've known a lot. Some have even been related to me, and I used to go and interview them when I was a business writer. The trouble is there's something called the tragedy of the commons, where if you don't regulate something, people take everything. And that's basically what's happened. The federal government has been regulating cod and other major fish stocks off New England, Georges Bank, Gulf of Maine for a long time. And they've restricted catches in a lot of places, very, quite rigorously. And the fishermen say, no, this is all wrong, and actually you go over here catching lots of fish in this or that spot, because there are variations in areas as to the density of the fish. But the trouble is, overall, the numbers are overwhelmingly on the side of the government. Anyway, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, who's facing re-election next year, and certainly doesn't want to anger the fishermen of Gloucester or New Bedford, places like that, especially Gloucester. New Bedford's mostly scallops. He commissioned a scientific study by the state, by scientists working with the state, and they found, if anything, it's even worse than what the Fed said. That the ravaging of the stocks is more severe. This is the case of cod, and things are bad.
And is it a fine line between the government, as you said, saying to fishermen, there's a quota, and
yeah, right.
we've even got to tighten that quota up.
I mean, government's got a role there. It doesn't, in my view, it doesn't have a role in pet grooming.
Well, I'd be very interested to see if that gets any traction. I'm sure that would be fodder for
you bet.
Column fair discussion here at Go Local.
You bet.
As always, love reading your columns on the weekend, Bob. So appreciate your coming in
Good.
as you do every
Cheers.
Thursday. We'll talk next week. Okay,
See
Bob
you soon.
Whitcomb, Go Local columnist, talking about last week's column. And as we just discussed, a lot has happened since last week. As we discussed, his column mentioned that there was some specter of Lifespan's acquisition of Care New England as of last week, but as Go Local was first to report this week in the market, we were able to break that Care New England is actually in talks with partners up in Boston about a potential merger. Obviously, all eyes are on that. And if you didn't see the piece today in Go Local, 7 potential implications about this merger. So take a look. It's something that we'll certainly be talking and writing about.